All right, so today I'm gonna tackle a topic that we've probably all at one point or another seen. So we might be on social media and we could be, for instance, as in this example, but it extends further outside of this example. We might be on like a social media Facebook group, for instance, but again, it extend outward, and we see some like really strange looking posts like this. Now, I think that this post is a joke, but here they're posting in a single snowboarders and skiers group. It's clearly a dude's profile with a fake looking profile, and the profile image is political. It's talking about voting, and probably, I don't even know what this cover says, but this might not even be political in nature. And then there's these just really strange photos. Like he has photos, it's a dude's name with photos of a woman, and then there's photos of cash in a car. And so when we look at this kind of content, it just makes no sense. It doesn't look like, for example, a different type of scam or fraudulent type of content, such as with this one, again, posted in the same group. This one's kind of advertising a WhatsApp group. So this is probably more of like a classical fraud example that's directly trying to solicit people's involvement to like get them to give up a Bitcoin wallet. But because this first form of effectively fraud is much harder to dissect and understand why it's doing what it's doing, I think that's the reason to create some kind of a video today. So what I'll go over in this video is basically trying to help people understand like why this type of content appears, who's behind this type of content, what the objective of this type of content is. And I'm mostly going to talk about the technology. I'm not going to get really into like the politics. I'm not really going to get into who did what wrong, who's to blame, or even make a diagnosis of what to do about it, since that I think would be too complicated of one topic. But to dive in, I think I want to first make a statement that when we see an account, like this one, where it has like, it just looks to us to be something that's probably fake, we have to keep in mind that there's probably hundreds, if not thousands, of accounts like this. So that's the first statement. The second statement is that because a platform like Facebook so heavily guards against automation, which is a separate topic I can get into in separate videos, but generally speaking, the technical barrier to entry to automate something like usage on a platform like Facebook is so difficult that basically the options, and I can try to pull up a photo here in real time since I did it before, but the options would be like a wall of mobile phones in India. Maybe you've seen something like this, where they'll have cell phones to do two-factor auth, on a kind of a big plywood board, and they'll have people in a click farm, I think is the proper term. People that will have a job to log in to a phone similar to this, which is just an absolutely insane concept. So that's one way that you could exploit a platform like Facebook, due to the way that Facebook technologically guards against fraud on its platform. So any kind of automated use of the platform is very strictly guarded against. So it would either require this type of strange click farm type of setup, and we can talk about that usage, or it would require a level of automation that would require a large amount of budget. And so there's two things that we have to explore. So we have to explore first the return on investment. So you have to look at these types of schemes of, for instance, in like the classical fraud example right here, where someone wants them to join like a WhatsApp group, a Telegram group, and they're going to eventually like maybe try to solicit personal information or whatever. So that's a more classical example of fraud, and we have to go back to this example, I think, of like this type of click farm, and we have to ask, what's the return on investment for paying this type of worker to then solicit a kind of a fraud scheme. So that's one angle of like, why would somebody do this? Another possible outcome could be, for instance, a more benign form of trying to create a social media influencer campaign to maybe boost an account. So this could be like someone that's based in like a media based economy city like LA, and they're going to outsource to a cheap labor pool like in Southeast Asia to do this sort of click farm activity to benignly try to boost, even if it's unethical, benignly try to boost some social media account. There's a bizarre story that I could probably, again, pull up here in real time. And it was something like Chinese social media influence moving into wealthy neighborhood. Let's see what we get. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it, but basically, if you went and go ahead to search this type of search query, what you'd find is basically they're talking about that they would locate click farms in wealthy neighborhoods to influence wealthy people because of some exploitation of algorithms. And this was sort of depicted in a viral social media video to talk about how insane some of these click farm tactics have become. And now the other piece I didn't even talk about, so if we talk about the return on investment, it's pretty de minimis. It's not really that worth it for the amount of effort involved. And so there's the return on investment side, and then there's the legal side. And in terms of at least US law or Western law or anywhere there would be like any sort of extradition possibility, the general case for legality of automating usage on a platform like Facebook that uses algorithms to specifically prohibit fraud can face criminal liability. And so when we talk about criminal liability, that starts to introduce such a significant barrier to this sort of automated profile creation that it starts to really narrow down that this type of activity would only occur in a non-extradition country. So for instance, like China or Russia. But we start to look at that landscape, and that also becomes very suspect for that benign use case of anybody just trying to do a basic fraud scheme. And we start to get into the state actor possibility. And so I think where I'm trying to tend to go with this video is to discuss how when we look at a profile like this one that has kind of like this obviously fake profile, and the posted content is so strange. I'm the real Shekela Mifrin. It almost it begs us to look at the absurdity of this and to wonder. And so I think today I'm trying to explore that sort of state actor idea of what happens when you have hundreds or thousands of these accounts, and what's the motivation behind this. And we can only begin to peek at the influences. And so I think in order to understand this, we need to sort of start to dive into this idea of looking at social media in the way that a computer might. And we'll work backwards toward the motivation, I think, of why these tactics would be used. I think one of the most important things is to understand that there are going to be hundreds or thousands or even hundreds of thousands of these fake profiles. And as we sort of look at for instance, this is a blog post about someone visualizing their LinkedIn network. For instance, when I interviewed at LinkedIn, they gave they gave out handouts of a similar visualization to try to motivate and stimulate the idea and the power of data. But typically, like each one of these circles in this graph would kind of represent a person, most likely. And in particular, the way a computer tends to look at this data structure is that the size of the circle indicates maybe the influence of a particular person, and then the lines are indicating the number of connections and who they're connected to. The grouping of these circles in different colors would be called clustering, and that's something that's very important to machine learning and any kind of algorithmic based understanding of data. In other words, computers have to do something to make sense of the sheer amount of data that's out there. So these are algorithms that I'm discussing that describe how a computer is able to determine what content to show to you and to answer in a meaningful way when you perform like a search query what results to display to you. So going back to this blog post, if we kind of scroll down through it, the person goes through an analysis and says like, oh, this must be when I worked for Cisco Systems in my network there. You know, this is when I worked for Disney. Again, just to remind, we're talking about a graph-based, this would be called, the picture is called a graph. It's a graph-based representation of someone's LinkedIn network. So personal communities, he's talking about recruiters. And so this is just a very entry-level idea of how to look at and visually look at how a computer would understand networks. And networks of information can exist or represent all kinds of different things. In the computer sciences, this would be called, specifically the term would be graph. You could Wikipedia it, and then I think you could look up graph theory. And so most of the complex data structures within computers tend toward a graph because you can tend to represent a lot of data and a lot of different types of data. To continue going through different examples, here's another example of a LinkedIn graph representation. Again, showing different clustering that's going on, mapping to a person's different points in their professional career. Graphs can also be used to analyze fraud. Even though we're talking about fraud in this case, and we're sort of talking about how there's obvious holes in the system. Here, I'm trying to show an example that along the lines connecting, so the circles are usually referred to as nodes. The lines that connect the nodes together are called edges, and then typically they can be labeled, so how they have used with, linked to, etc. That would be called kind of like either a label, or sometimes what we can see is, I think in this other example, we can see sometimes you can have numbers associated between nodes, and that would represent something called a weight. And so let's try to remember that concept of a weight. Again, these are all keywords, whether we're talking about nodes, edges, weights, labels. These all live inside the space that makes up modern AI and machine learning. We're going to focus on weights to understand, going back to this type of fraud example. And let me see if there's anything else to cover. This is kind of maybe a more comprehensive example of how to visualize that in these large-scale types of fraud, doing these types of graph analysis can be used in industry. This is an example of understanding the flow of money that on the appearance might seem pretty innocuous, but winds up flowing into either sanctioned countries' economics, flowing to, in this case in the bottom right, arms dealers, and then in the bottom left flowing to people that are engaged in illegal ivory trade. So if we kind of bubble up from some of that, I mean that's a lot of very technical stuff, but the idea here is if we think about how something like Facebook would even begin to look at or deconstruct data, we have to kind of consider the different metrics that Facebook plays with, because, or any social media platform for that matter would play with, because that's how it's ultimately going to make a decision of automation. So for instance, what content to suggest when you're sort of scrolling through a post and you see like a news article, what comments to maybe show first. Because not only are the posts that are selected, so for instance, let's say we're talking about YouTube, to give a different social media example. So you go to YouTube's homepage, and the content on your YouTube homepage will be a curated selection based on channels you follow, freshness of content, and then additionally, it will sometimes create these kind of out of the blue recommendations as well, to try to all of it is kind of algorithmic based decision making to try to increase metrics like viewership, retention of you as a user, because these things all then funnel into another automated model of ad spend, which is how these companies make revenue. So there's been a lot of industry discussion for over 10 years that I'm not going to get into in the video how that is played out in terms of politics and money, but it's been a very well-known thing that these are all generally regarded as pretty badly incentivized and architected economic models for these types of companies. But the general idea is that at every step of the way, there's some kind of automation targeted to you, the user, to increase things like engagement, which again flow back to that model of automation. So now, with some of that more further background said, and we take let's go back to our example of this type of fraud post. Now, what I think is going on here is that in something like this, so I have to also specify that I started to see an uptick of fake bot posts in this particular Facebook group on a particular day, when basically one guy decided, it was rather funny, one guy decided that he was going to post a shirtless photo, and he kind of made a ridiculous remark like, come on ladies, come and get it. And so basically that then created a huge surge of posts. And I believe that what happened at this point was that there were probably bots monitoring in one shape or form activity. And because the people that are authoring these software programs, again, probably state actors due to technical cost to automate against a platform like Facebook, again, due to legal issues with automating against a platform like Facebook. And so after they're reading and seeing the activity, they know that any engagement is going to have, if we go back to this chart, it's going to have a higher weightedness. So for any kind of engagement in a highly trending topic, there will be a higher level of visibility. And if we go back to a post like this, the purpose of this post is not the end game. The end game is not this post. The purpose of this post is to post something so absurd that it solicits likes. The goal is to get reactions. I believe that in Facebook, they would treat a reaction as a more meaningful response even than a like. Of course, comments as well also would weight, again, if we go back to this particular model, it would weight higher even than a reaction post. So the goal, when we think about, again, if we look at, this is an example of a LinkedIn graph, the sheer amount of data and the ability for computers to do things like process, and the ability for these very long-winded, deeply networked schemes that are automated by computers, we can start to look at things like, again, here's another more nuanced and potentially harder to detect fraud post. And the guy looks like a clean cut enough person, but as soon as we dig into the profile, and you've probably seen this around, and we look at what's going on the profile, we see something that looks even loosely related to skiing or snowboarding. And it doesn't take long after we click in to view the profile that, even this person had a profile created as long ago as 2008, and as we scroll down, we see some conflicting details very quickly. So the person, being from California, that's fine, or living in California, being from Guadalajara originally. But then it doesn't take us long for scrolling to see some kind of politically motivated post. And so there's this idea that if we go back to the weightedness, you could have entire networks of fake profiles where you could have, let's say, 100 of these fake profiles that are just trying to post absurdity to generate likes and comments. And what they're doing is that, because there's that connectedness of the graph, again, with the weighted chart example. So if you have, maybe this example might better visualize it. So if your fraud network is this network in teal, and your end goal is to create political content that sows chaos, you might have dozens or hundreds of these smaller nodes that are doing simply inane posts, like trying to elicit likes and comments, because what they're doing is they're gaining credibility. So they're going from this size dot that I'm trying to hover my mouse over to maybe this size dot that's slightly larger. And then what they're trying to do is they're trying to give that credibility, again, through this connected weightedness, which is part of the analysis in determining what content to promote. They're trying to then give that credibility to an even larger node, which will then sow the chaos and the disruptive type of message. So I'm trying to think if I've left anything out in this topic, but in general, the idea is that when we have thousands, so we have to look at if we recap, so we have to look at sort of these inane looking bot posts. They don't have any value really on their own, but when we look at them inside of a graph, added up hundreds or thousands of times, they don't tend to really show any kind of strong ROI potential. The legality issues of it tend to relegate them to certain countries, so they really do place them into the realm of what could feasibly be state actors. And then when we look at the potential for the bad economic incentives of trying to glue user eyeballs to engagement because it boosts ad dollars, it's studied and known that inflammatory content, whether is going to engage people more. So there's kind of an alignment between these state bot networks, state-sponsored bot networks that are trying to sow discord and chaos, and the social media companies who gain more ad revenue due to the increased engagement. And so I think just educating that when you see something that seems like kind of innocuous, similar to the more classical fraud example of, hey, join my WhatsApp or Telegram group, these more elongated schemes are probably part of a much larger network to give credibility to accounts that have some kind of target behavior of just injecting themselves into news. So I'm going to probably cut it there. I think I've been as succinct as I possibly can be, but today's video is kind of running a bit long. But I hope that provides a bit of insight into why what you see on social media occurs and what the long tail impacts are. And in terms of what to do about it, I could say to people, like, just don't interact with posts like that. But I think the bigger problem is reforming the bad incentives within some of these social media companies, because the experts within the industry do know what's going on. They do know that it's creating harm, and they're doing it anyway. And unfortunately, they have figured out as well how to gamify the law, and they're sort of sticking to incentives like their fiduciary duty to shareholders instead of like basic moral and ethical and civic duties that these platforms clearly have an influence on. So not like the brightest topic, but I hope this was informative. And of course, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and talk to you soon.